I'm Javier Barrera on Insight. In Mexico, investigative journalism can be a life-threatening profession. In Reportero, director Bernardo Ruiz spends time with journalists who defy powerful drug cartels and corrupt officials to continue reporting the news.
En el periódico donde yo estaba me tocó recibir una llamada y entonces una persona que me preguntó, busco a Sergio Haro, yo soy, tú eres Sergio Haro, sí. ¿Sabes qué, pendejo? Así me dijo textualmente, ¿sabes qué, pendejo? Ni sabes en la que te metiste. Vas a chingar tu madre, te voy a matar, cabrón.
My name is Bernardo Ruiz, and I'm the director-producer of Reportero. Reportero is a feature documentary that looks at a veteran reporter and his colleagues at an embattled news weekly in Mexico.
What motivated you to make this film?
When I first began Reportero, I was actually researching another story. I was actually researching a story about a shelter for deported children in the border city of Mexicali, which is the capital of Baja California. So I started doing research in 2007, looking to do a short piece about deported teens and children in this border city. And while I was there, it was really the beginning of the wave of violence that we know has consumed Mexico today, with somewhere between 50,000 and 88,000 dead. So once I started talking to people and hearing stories about how the violence had increased so dramatically in such a short period of time, I sought out the counsel of a local journalist, and everyone I talked to said, you need to talk to a veteran reporter, Sergio Cordero. And so I eventually had a brief meeting with him, and that really was the genesis of the project. This is a kind of short interview that turned into a 3-hour conversation.
And why did you choose Zeta Weekly?
You know, in September of 2010, very famously, a daily in the city of Juarez, El Diario de Juarez, actually published an open letter to the international community saying, we are no longer going to, you who are the de facto authorities talking about the organized crime groups, you tell us what we should and shouldn't publish. Very recently, El Mañana, which is another daily in the border city of Nuevo Laredo, they also published an open letter saying, we're just not going to cover organized crime battles anymore. It's just too risky for us and our reporters. So Zeta, although they operate in a different context, is unusual in Mexico because they are relentless in their coverage. They have not stopped covering on organized crime, the activities of cartel bosses. It's actually their bread and butter. So from the standpoint of a documentary filmmaker, figuring out why they continue to report the way they do and what kind of drives their reporters to do the kind of work that they do, that was really the kind of spark for the film.
In your film, Sergio Jara is this intrepid reporter covering pretty dangerous news, and his editor, Adela Navarro, also takes risks reporting. What can you tell me about these individuals?
Adela Navarro Bello is a really fascinating figure. She's one of a handful of female editors in Mexico. She basically took over the reins of the newspaper after the founder died in 2006, and she's the co-director, but she's really the heart and soul of the newspaper, and she runs a very tight ship. So she's making the key editorial decisions. She writes a weekly column in the weekly, and Sergio Haro is her beat reporter. Sergio Haro is basically a veteran reporter. He's been covering the region for 3 decades, and he covers every type of story out there. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on him, because although he does hit the crime stories, the organized crime stories, he's also looking for different types of stories, the story behind the story, as it were. He's telling stories about deported children. He's looking at stories of the landless and the homeless. He's after those human stories through which you can see the fault lines in Mexican society.
From this film, it looks like the history of killing journalists actually began before the narcos. Was this surprising to you?
That's a really great point, and I think that was something that I really wanted to do in the film. And I think one of the things that you see in the film is that this history of repression and attacks against journalists has its roots going all the way back. I mean, pretty much throughout the history of the PRI, or the ruling party in Mexico. It does, however, get an accelerated push in the 90s, beginning with the rise of organized crime. And certainly that unholy mix of organized crime and official politics in Mexico, that's really where the danger lies. Those journalists who have worked to kind of uncover the links between organized crime and politics in Mexico, those who've gotten really close are the ones who've paid, the biggest price.
In the film, we find out about 2 assassinations and 1 attempted assassination on the journalists at Zeta. How do they manage to keep reporting? What motivates them to continue to work every day?
I think that's a really good, the question of what motivates the reporters is a really good question. And I think that's at the heart of the film. And that's something that I wanted to get at. And I don't think we ever come to a satisfactory conclusion about what keeps them going. Each reporter has a different reason for doing what they do. Sergio Otto in the film tells us that he feels like it's his job or his duty to do one piece of the puzzle. It's up to the authorities to prosecute crimes. It's up to civil society to move on information. But he sees his role in a very specific way. His job is to report on what he sees and what he uncovers. And then it's up to civil society or the legal system to do something with that information. Unfortunately, very often, the law doesn't do much with that information. But he feels like to give up, to not do that, would make him an accomplice. And that's actually something he says in the film. If I did nothing, then I myself would become an accomplice. So I think that's part of Zeta's mission. It's this dogged desire to just continue to report on the stories that other people aren't reporting on. And again, in the case of Sergio Otto, he's interested in the human story, the kind of stories that fall between the cracks often and don't necessarily make the headlines.
What did you want your film to convey?
I think for me as a filmmaker who was born in Mexico but grew up here in the United States, I was interested in telling a different type of story about Mexico that still addressed what's Mexico's current situation and the challenge that it's facing in dealing with this new wave of violence and instability. But I wanted to get beyond the headlines. I think in through 2007 and 2009, there were a lot of cable news packages about the so-called drug war that were hyper-sensationalistic, it was hyperbolic, and again, there was no context. It was just body count journalism. And I just kept hungering for a deeper story. For who's on the front lines, who's covering this stuff, what's the deeper story? And I just was really unsatisfied with what I was seeing. And so my curiosity to just talk to people and find out what was happening to the country that I'd been born in, that sort of provoked this search. And I hope that the film demonstrates, highlights the work of journalists and people who are doing their best in a very difficult situation. And I think that my hope is that the film, especially for a US and an international audience, introduces people to a history and a context that they weren't familiar with. And for me, the film was a learning process. I really had to bone up on Mexican history, certainly through the 80s and 90s. And I hope that the film is useful in that way as a kind of a tool to contextualize the current crisis that Mexico is facing.